My name is Kevin Boyle, and I teach American history at Northwestern University in suburban Chicago. The primary source that I gave you is absolutely appalling. It's so appalling that we're tempted not to look at it, to turn away from it, not to see what it says, what it shows us. And there are some people who say that we shouldn't look at it, that by taking that picture in, what we're doing is we're joining the spectacle of that horrible moment. But I think we do need to look at it. We need to look at it because of the horror it reveals. The photo was taken sometime after midnight on August 8th, 1930, in the courthouse square in Little Marion, Indiana, in northeast Indiana. It was taken just a couple of hours after a massive white mob in that town lynched two young African-American men, Abe Smith and Tommy Shipp, for the crime, the alleged crime, of raping a young white woman who was also same age they were, 18 years old. That night, the mob almost lynched a third young man, 16-year-old James Cameron. They dragged him out of the same prison they had taken Shipp and Smith from. They took him down to the courthouse square. They put the rope around his neck. And then, for reasons that nobody's ever really been able to explain, they let him go. If you want to hear James Cameron's story, told by Cameron himself when he was an older man, you can find it on YouTube. The events of that night, though, really in a fundamental way, stretch way back beyond that night in August of 1930. It stretches all the way back to slavery, the American slave system, which could only be maintained if the whites who profited from it believed deep in their hearts that the human beings that they enslaved, that they claimed as property, were inherently inferior to them. The story of that night stretches back to Reconstruction, to the years immediately after the Civil War, when newly freed people claimed for themselves, won for themselves, legal equality in the United States. And it stretches back most directly to the 2 decades around the turn of the 20th century, to the 1890s and the 1900s, when whites in this country tore down the promises, the guarantees of Reconstruction, and put in its place a system of racial domination and subjugation that stretched in different ways from the Deep South to the farthest reaches of the North. And the way they did that, the way they constructed that system of racial domination, was through horrific violence, through a reign of terror that was designed to drive home to African Americans their inferior status, and to drive home to whites the power they held because of white supremacy. And the worst manifestation of that violence, the worst form of that violence, was the frenzy of lynching that swept across the South in those 2 decades right around the turn of the 20th century. Swept across the Deep South, reached up into sections of the North. At its very worst, at its worst moment, its worst year in 1892, an African American was lynched on average in the United States once every 2 days. And time again, when those mobs murdered African Americans, photographers came out to take a picture of the scene, to give the mob a souvenir of what they've done. And that's what happened in Marion on that night of August 8th, 1930 as well. That year, there were only 21 lynchings in the United States. The great frenzy of the earlier part of the century had faded away. But the violence was still there. Shipp and Smith were lynched probably sometime around 10 o'clock on August 7th, 1930. The mob milled around for hours and hours afterwards out on the courthouse square. And then, as I said a couple minutes ago, sometime around a little after midnight, a man by the name of Lawrence Beitler, who was a photographer, he owned a photography studio a couple of blocks from the courthouse square. He went down to his shop, he brought out his big old camera, he brought it down to the courthouse square, he set it up, and he took the photo that you see. And then he went back to his studio, back to his darkroom, and produced as many copies as he could, which he sold for 50 cents a piece. A souvenir, a commemoration for the members of that mob so that they could remember the moment where they proved their superiority through their utter barbarism. Thank you very much for letting me join your class today.